Hello, Donald Robertson. Nice to meet you. Thank you for being here today with me.
Hello, it's nice to meet you too. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for writing how to think like a Roman emperor, because it's a very insightful book, and I'm reading it next to the meditations. So it's actually helping me to understand better the meditations, because every time you mention it, I'm going through the specific passage, and it's amazing. Thank you for writing it.
Awesome, good. Yeah, well, one of the things I hoped was that it would help people to enjoy the meditations, and get more benefit from Marcus Aurelius.
You did it.
Cool.
I have the first question I have is, why did you choose Marcus Aurelius instead of, I don't know, Seneca or Epictetus?
Well, that's easy, because I wanted to write about someone who could be a role model or an example. And actually, first of all, I thought maybe Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. We have some stories about him. But the stories about Zeno are quite distant in the past, less reliable sources. And the thing about Marcus Aurelius is, because he was a Roman emperor, we know far more about his life. We have archaeological evidence, even evidence from coins. We have 3 surviving Roman histories of his reign, and we have a cache of his private letters. And also the Meditations is quite a personal book in a way. He begins the first chapter talking a lot about his family and his teachers. So we know much more about Marcus Aurelius than about any other Stoic philosopher, and probably more about him than about most other philosophers in general. And also Epictetus we know very little about. And Seneca we know a bit about, but Seneca's not as inspiring a role model. Marcus arguably lived more consistently in accord with Stoic teachings than Seneca did. Seneca's life famously is in some ways in conflict with his writings. So that's why I chose Marcus Aurelius. He's a good person to write about. He's one of my favorites, and my other favorite historical figure is Socrates, and they're very different. Although they hold many similar beliefs, Socrates is a much more complex, multifaceted character. Marcus Aurelius is more kind of straightforward in a way.
Yeah, I agree, but maybe for us, like normal human beings, maybe we feel more identified with, I don't know, with Socrates instead of Marcus Aurelius, right? Because he's an emperor. We are not emperors.
Yeah, maybe because he's so powerful, like that makes it harder to. But I thought maybe you would say we would identify more with Marcus, because Socrates is a strange person. He's very complicated, and even the Greeks like to say, they said that Socrates was atopos in Greek, which means like a weirdo, like an alien, like he didn't belong in Athens. So they found him quite puzzling. He was like an eccentric, we would say today in English. So I think people think of Marcus, even though he's very powerful, in some ways is being more down to earth.
What's the most fascinating thing you find in Marcus Aurelius? What's the thing you like the most about him?
Well, it's a very general thing. It's just the fact that in the Meditations, it's almost like we can peer inside his mind because it's private, and he's talking about his personal psychological journey. So it's like reading someone's diary in a way, or their therapy case notes. So we learn very much about the application of Stoic philosophy to problems of living, but we, in a very personal way, almost like we can imagine that we're right there beside him and we get to know him as an individual. So I find that fascinating. And also, I mean, if you mean in terms of specific things in his life, I find it in many things. I find it interesting that Marcus had no military training, as far as we know. I'm pretty sure that he didn't. He was like a bureaucrat, a career politician, we would say. And then because of the fact that his adoptive brother died, he was left taking operational command of the largest army ever assembled on a Roman frontier, 140,000 men under his command on the Danube frontier, which is like a lot of people.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to imagine that, and he must have seemed very out of his depth. I think at first the army thought, who is this guy? Like, is he going to be a good leader? But he won their respect, and by the end of it, the Roman legions, from what we're told, really embraced him as their commander-in-chief.
And maybe one of the reasons, one of the things I like the most about your book is that you said that Marcus Aurelius could have chosen the path of Hadrian and the Sophists, which seems to be easier, right? And he chose the most difficult one, to be virtuous, and maybe that's one of the reasons, right?
I think that's a very interesting thing. I suppose one of the intriguing things about Marcus Aurelius is that he says that he had a bad temper, that he struggled with anger. And indeed, the Meditations talks a lot about anger. It's one of the main themes in the book. And I think if we look very closely, we get the impression that Marcus Aurelius sees his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, his predecessor as emperor, as almost a perfect emperor. And I think he sees Hadrian, and Marcus mainly saw Hadrian towards the end of his life as quite a bad emperor, a tyrant. And I think Marcus feels that he's somewhere in between, and that he feels that maybe he could have a bad temper like Hadrian. He could be corrupted by sophists and flatterers like Hadrian. And he's struggling to try and be less like Hadrian and more like Antoninus Pius. And I think he sees Stoicism as a way of helping to make sure that he becomes more like Antoninus Pius. Although I think Antoninus Pius was more naturally, I don't think he had to train in Stoicism. I think he was just naturally this very serene, uncorrupted, thoughtful emperor.
And what about Trajanus? I think it's in English. I read
Trajan.
Yeah, Trajan. Sorry, Trajan. I read a book about Trajan, a trilogy, and I find similarities between Trajan and Marcus Aurelius more than, right?
Interesting. Yeah. Well, that's very interesting, actually. Yeah, more than Hadrian. Yeah, like Trajan would. Marcus mentions Trajan very briefly. Maybe he would have had something in common with him. Possibly, yeah, more than Hadrian. I feel almost didn't really like Rome that much. I think he felt that he didn't fit in. They say the first time he spoke in the Senate, the senators laughed at him because of his accent. He had a provincial accent, Spanish accent.
Yeah, he was Spanish.
Kind of. And he spent a lot of time, more time than any other emperor, away from Rome. Yeah. He almost wanted to make Athens like the second center of the empire. I think he felt much more comfortable in Athens. And so he had a difficult relationship with the Senate. I think Marcus was much more at home in Rome and fitted into the Senate. Loved Marcus, and they embraced him much more than Hadrian.
Yeah. And definitely I feel very identified with Marcus, more than with Hadrian, for instance, where we try to be speak to the truth, right? That's one of the things I like about Marcus Aurelius. What are the key learnings or the key lessons you learn about Marcus Aurelius for living in the 21st century?
For living in the 20th, well, I mean, in a way, everything that's in Marcus Aurelius, we can find in most of it. We can find in the other Stoics as well. So we learn general stuff about Stoicism. But I think, I mean, obviously we'll talk about the pandemic, but Marcus's book was written in the middle of a pandemic, a plague, and you could almost read it as a kind of psychological manual for coping with the stress of a pandemic. So I think it seems very relevant in that sense. And also Marcus, because he's emperor, although he seems distant from us, in a way, we're all like Roman emperors now. We all are in the first world anyway. People in modern society, because of the internet, we're all a little bit spoiled and privileged, almost like Roman senators or Roman nobles. So we do kind of have something in common with a Roman emperor, many of us today. Maybe that's why Marcus Aurelius and the Meditations are particularly common in large cosmopolitan modern cities like Toronto and New York and London, and particularly with millennials who work in the tech industry. So Marcus, I think a provincial Roman might feel quite, like many people in the ancient world, naturally more fatalistic, because they would have a sense of having very limited knowledge and limited control in terms of the events that were happening on the global stage. Whereas Marcus, like a modern person, knows everything that's happening throughout the empire. He's at this kind of hub, the center. Now, we're all in the hub at the center now because we're connected to the internet. So we do have this odd thing in common with him. And so he's trying to cope with this enormous stress of being conscious of these huge world events that are circling around him. And we feel that stress every time we turn on the news and look on the internet today. So I think that's very relevant. And, so he gives us strategies such as the view from above that help us to adopt a different perspective on things so that we perhaps feel less overwhelmed by them.
And now that you mentioned the view from above, which is a psychotherapy technique, I appreciate your work a lot because I'm interested in psychotherapy and also in philosophy, and you are building a bridge between them. What's the relationship between them? Is there, what came first, psychology or maybe Stoicism? Or, we don't know. What supports one another?
Well, you say building a bridge, and that's how it seems to many people. But originally, there was no division. Like they were the same thing. I'm just putting back together something that we broke, we pulled apart over the course of history. So for Marcus, there would be no difference between psychotherapy and philosophy. They're two different aspects of the same thing. Or you could say psychotherapy is a branch of philosophy, perhaps. But certainly it was something that philosophers did. I'll give you a very lightning tour, actually. This is how I think it began. I think what we call psychotherapy, in a sense, begins with the Greek mystery religions. And in particular, the god of healing, who's the god of therapy, who would deal with physical healing, but also psychological and emotional healing. So this would be Apollo. And the Delphic oracle of Apollo, we're told, passed the teachings, the ethical teachings, the therapeutic teachings, onto Pythagoras, who's one of the most important pre-Socratic followers. So the Stoics were very influenced by. And this is, I think, is the beginning of a therapeutic, spiritual, philosophical tradition that goes all the way through the mystery religions, the pre-Socratics, through Socrates, who becomes very interested in philosophy as a type of therapy. The Socratic method, Socrates says, is his method of questioning, is a therapy, a medicine for the mind, he says. It cures us, Socrates says, of a kind of intellectual conceit, or a sort of moral conceit or arrogance. And then the Stoics, out of all of the Hellenistic schools of philosophy, are, I would say, the one that places by far the most emphasis on the therapeutic aspect of philosophy. So I think these things were always very closely connected. And then they became separated. And then they got joined again in a way because modern cognitive therapy was inspired by Stoicism and drew upon ideas. Freud, not so much, but the cognitive therapists from the 1950s onwards really were talking about Epictetus and drawing on aspects of Stoic philosophy for modern psychotherapy.
And why do you think, because right now we have internet, we have studies, we have research, we have everything we want to, the information, but back then they have nothing. They have, like, they created everything just based on observation and trial and error, doing self-examinating. Do you think we can behave like that currently? We can do the same exercises, or to be more, I think so, like Socrates? Or
it seems to me, actually, for whatever reason, many of the Stoic techniques are still relevant today. We do similar things, not exactly the same, but we do many similar things in cognitive therapy, and they work. Cognitive therapy is supported by a lot of research. And also the growth of popularity in Stoicism. Stoicism has become far more popular over the past few decades. And then during the pandemic, again, Stoicism became much more popular. Sales of books by Marcus Aurelius and Seneca exploded during the pandemic. So people seem to feel that Stoicism is beneficial and they can actually apply it in practice. And why would that be? You know, I think in part because there's something they don't get from psychotherapy or CBT, which is CBT is more like a bunch of techniques or strategies, and it's time limited. And that's part of the whole point of it. You do it for a few weeks or months, and then you kind of stop. You might carry on doing aspects of it, but cognitive therapy has never aimed to provide a philosophy of life. It's not meant to be permanent in a sense, in the way that Stoicism is. But if someone does cognitive therapy and they benefit from it, then they think, well, maybe this tells me something about life in general. Maybe, you know, the ideas and techniques would be relevant across the whole board. And if I was to take the basic insights of cognitive therapy and turn them into a philosophy of life, like a yoga, you'd probably end up with something that looks like Stoicism anyway. And unlike modern academic philosophy, I think people think that modern philosophy, postmodernism, existentialism, and so on, are unhelpful. They just confuse people, and they don't really give them practical strategies. They're not down to earth enough. So people find in ancient philosophy something more like a Western yoga, like a Western equivalent of Buddhism, that it's simple enough that they can actually put it into practice and benefit from it. And I think partly because in the ancient world, people maybe had more time to reflect on their daily life. They were more down to earth, more pragmatic about coping with their emotions, more common sense in a way than we are today about some of these things. And I think that's partly why we feel we can benefit from them.
And I think you are the author that gives or provides more tools in your blog, website, and everything. And I'm curious about what is your daily Stoic routine or your daily Stoic habits that you implement in your life. Do you have a specific routine, or depends on the day?
It varies a little bit, but usually I try and follow a framework that we can kind of find hinted at in the Stoic literature, and also in Galen and some other authors, which is that in the morning I try and imagine the day ahead, and I think about how I could do better in terms of living more in accord with my virtues, values. So I try and prepare for the day ahead, and I try and imagine the contrast between what would happen if I allow my emotions to guide me, and what would happen if I allow reason and virtue to guide me. And that helps to build motivation, because I think, well, maybe over time there would be quite a big difference. So that helps to motivate. And then at the end of the day, based on something the Pythagoreans said, which the Stoics embraced, a poem called The Golden Verses of Pythagoras, it says, every day before you close your eyes to go to sleep, you should review the major events of the day and ask yourself 3 questions. What did you do well? What did you do badly? And what could you do differently next time? Basically, Seneca talks about this on anger. Epictetus also talks about it, and Galen talks about this as a technique as well. Marcus Aurelius, his physician, who wasn't a Stoic, but he had read the Stoics and was kind of influenced by their therapy. So we can piece together this strategy, and it creates a cycle. So if at the end of the day you review how things went, then the next day when you're planning the day ahead, you will be informed by the review that you did the previous day. And at the end of the day, when you're reviewing how things went, you'll be thinking of how you planned things at the beginning and the preparations that you did earlier. So the review in the evening and the preparation in the morning complement one another in I guess what I would call a learning cycle, hopefully they build on each other day after day. And then other techniques kind of plug into that, fit into that framework. So often I'll do the view from above, or I'll practice Stoic mindfulness. So throughout the day, I'll just try and observe my value judgments. And I would say very broadly, I try to observe how my thoughts, actions, and feelings are related and how they influence one another, but particularly how my value judgments might be influencing my emotions and my behavior.
And you do everything mentally, or do you write? Because I think, sorry, if I go
usually mentally.
Mentally. It's because if I go to bed and I start to do this exercise, I get asleep. So maybe it's better for me to write, or
it could be. It varies for different people. Actually, Socrates talks about something like this. I think it might be in Plato's Republic, and he mentions it's a good way to get to sleep. Like, he thinks it helps you sleep better. Maybe Seneca says that as well, actually, and on anger. I'll have to go back and check. But sometimes writing it down. In therapy today, we have kind of mixed feelings about clients writing lots of things down, like journaling and stuff. Journaling is very popular, but for certain people, it can be unhelpful, because it might fuel what we call ruminative thinking, which can contribute to anxiety and depression. So if you keep your journaling kind of concise, for many people it's a good thing. People who make lots and lots and lots of notes are sometimes overthinking. And so sometimes in therapy, I'll tell people to stop journaling and stop writing so much down. It depends on their personality and, if they have certain types of mental health problems.
And when you say that you plan your day, you do also like kind of premeditatio malorum, or only I'm going to do this till hour or this hour?
Yeah, like I'll imagine things going badly and how I would cope if I encounter people that are difficult, and if I don't achieve my goals, like how I would feel about that. So I prepare in advance to cope with setbacks with equanimity. And also I do contemplate my own mortality quite a lot. I wouldn't always recommend that to people, because again, if somebody's depressed and say they're suicidal, like, you might not say contemplate your own death, might not be appropriate. But for many people who are, especially if they're kind of used to doing things like this, then it can be incredibly powerful. So Seneca takes this to extremes, and he said every night when he goes to bed, he tells himself, I might not wake up again tomorrow morning. And every morning he says to himself, this might be my last day. And I find that actually quite useful. I find it helpful to think that way. It helps me to appreciate, be more grateful for the time that I have.
And one of the quotes I hear the most these days is, you can't improve what you can't measure. So how do we measure progress in Stoicism? How do we know we are improving?
Epictetus actually tells his students a technique for this. He sounds like a cognitive therapist when he says this. Just once, very briefly, he says that they should count how many days they're free from anger, or how many days they get angry. So keeping like a little tally or a record. And it's easy to actually monitor improvement. I'm very much in favor of getting clients to keep a tally of certain types of negative thoughts or feelings or bad habits. So it could be getting angry, or it could be getting depressed, or it could be worrying about something. So normally you pick something you want to change. And rather than keeping a sort of detailed record, I would just keep a count, a tally. So you might say, well, today, I thought self-critical thoughts, negative thoughts 20 times. And often when people begin counting, the number might go up actually, but usually over time, just by keeping a tally, it will tend to go down a bit. even if it doesn't go away completely, the number often reduces over the space of a week or so. So I really believe that keeping account is one of the simplest things, easiest things that people can do that potentially benefits them. And then you could almost draw a line graph and see the progress that you're making. And then this is removing something negative. To build something positive, we usually identify values or virtues, and then you might record how much time you spent each day doing something that was in accord with one of your core values. And that could be a useful way of tracking progress as well.
Yeah, I like that exercise. I'm already doing that just to track my attention. When I'm trying to watch an interview or to read a book, I draw a stick every time I am thinking in a different thing.
I think that's a good idea.
That's just imagining that we are listening to the Stoicism for the first time, and we want to start practice Stoicism. Where do I start if I'm new into Stoicism?
Well, it's funny because when people ask that, you know, I think often people think, is there like a technique that you should begin with? And actually, I love psychological techniques, but I'm going to say something a little bit different, which is partly because I've observed many people learning about Stoicism. I think actually people should begin by reading the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and then the practices come after that, because the Stoics believed that the techniques that they have, in order to really benefit from them, you could use them for different purposes. So we find similar techniques in several different schools of ancient philosophy. And the effect of those techniques, the meaning that they have, will vary depending on what your values are, what your underlying goals are. So I think that the Stoics would say, well, the first thing isn't really a technique. The first thing is to adopt Stoic values, and then the techniques take place on the basis of having those values. So you have to learn really what the Stoics mean by saying virtue is the only true good. And then that changes the significance, it changes the meaning of all the techniques they do. So I'd say start by reading Marcus Aurelius and just meditating on the meaning of the passages. And sometimes people will practice paraphrasing. That's what Marcus did. He would take philosophical ideas and try and put them in his own words. And so that could be useful as a way of just contemplating or trying to more deeply understand some of the ideas. And then I think the framework I described, where people practice for the day ahead and review at the end of the day their progress. But one of the main Stoic techniques is to notice when you're becoming upset about things, and to remind yourself to distinguish more clearly between things that are directly under your control and everything else. So by that, the Stoics mean that you should make a clear distinction between your own voluntary actions and things that merely happen to you. What's up to us and what's not up to us. That's the first sentence of Epictetus' handbook. So it's important to Stoicism. And then building on that, among the things that are up to us are our value judgments. And so when we're becoming upset in particular, we should learn to take that as a signal to say to ourselves, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And I call this cognitive distancing. That's a technical term we use in psychology for separating our thoughts from the external events to which they refer. And this is very foundational in Stoicism. It's really the psychological basis of most of the Stoic techniques. So practicing just saying to yourself, it's not things that upset me, but my opinions about them, and noticing the distinction between these things could be useful when we're getting angry or depressed or anxious.
I'm actually working on that a lot right now because I have a problem with first impressions. I try to get carried away by my emotions when I'm getting upset or when I am getting angry about something. I'm working on that a lot. It's very useful. What are the practices you know that work the best for general people? I mean, as you are a psychotherapist and you have a lot of clients, different clients with different problems, But is there something that works more or less for everyone?
Yeah. Well, actually, there are things that work for a lot of people. There are hundreds of therapy techniques. And as a therapist, I used to train therapists, and I specialized in teaching lots of different techniques. And some techniques are hard to learn or use. Some techniques only work for certain people. But there's other techniques that are easy and work for most people. Right? And the first book I wrote on Stoicism, I tried to list all of the techniques I could find in the Stoic books. And I found round about 18, right? So I think it helps to put a number on it. There's round about like 18 or 20 different psychological techniques in Marcus Aurelius. I'll give you an example. In book 11, passage 18, he talks about techniques for coping with anger. And for anger alone, he gives a list of 10 techniques. He actually calls them gifts from the god Apollo and the 9 muses, because Apollo was the leader of the 9 muses. And he repeats those techniques many, many times throughout the meditations. But also, they're not even all of the Stoic techniques for anger. In Seneca and Epictetus, there are other techniques for coping with anger. So it shows how many, in one place he's able to list 10, like a bullet point list of 10 separate techniques, like off the top of his head. Many techniques in Stoicism. So ones that are useful for people. Gosh, you talked about coping with first impressions. I think really one of the most useful techniques is a thing that we tend to call worry postponement. And in psychology, it was originally called the stimulus control method of managing worry, but most people call it worry postponement. And actually, it's useful not only for worry, but also for any kind of extended thinking, what psychologists call perseverative thinking. So when you're thinking about something for too long. So worrying is a way of thinking about something for a long period of time. Also rumination, where you dwell on the past, and maybe if you're depressed. And also anger, you have angry rumination, where you have revenge fantasies and you spend hours thinking about all the different ways you're going to get back at people who have upset you. This is a form of perseverative thinking. So all of these. And Epictetus talks about something very similar. And actually the Pythagoreans and other ancient philosophers had a similar idea as well. It's a very simple idea. So there's a psychologist called Tom Borkovec in America who's an expert on worry, and he really popularized this technique. It was used with students in the 1980s, and I think the first research studies on the method, and they found that students following this method at college in America reduced the intensity, frequency, and duration of worry episodes by round about half over the space of, I think it was a week or 2 weeks. And all that it involves doing is, first of all, you have to notice when you're beginning to worry or beginning to ruminate. So you have to look out for telltale signs. And actually, it's better if you can spot signs that you hadn't noticed before and catch yourself even earlier. So you might just notice that you're beginning to frown when you worry, or you might notice that you just kind of stare into the distance, or perhaps you fidget with your hands. So looking out for things that would tell you that you're starting to go into that mode of thinking. And then you would just make a note, maybe on a piece of paper or a computer, of the subject that you're worrying or thinking about, but you keep it very brief. So just, just like worrying about money, or, if you have revenge, if you're angry, you might be like, thinking about killing my boss at work or something like that. Thinking of ways to torture somebody I don't like or something like that. So whatever it is, very briefly. And then you kind of fold it up and you put it away and you say, I'm going to come back to this later. And so the skill that you're developing, the cognitive skill, is the ability to notice the initial automatic thought and then suspend or delay your response to it until a specific time. So we call that worry time. So you would sit down at a specific time usually the same time each evening. And then you decide whether you think it's still worthwhile to think about the problem. And if it is, you do it in a more calm and more rational, more controlled way. And this is a very powerful and a very simple technique that people can use for lots of different problems. There are other simple techniques that, another really good one is just to, the problem with simple techniques is people need to kind of understand the concept. So sometimes it takes a little bit of coaching, a little bit of explanation. But for example, one of the most powerful techniques is cognitive distancing. And there are many ways of achieving that. But one of them is that when you notice you're getting upset, you would just say to yourself, I notice right now that Donald is telling himself this is a disaster, or whatever it is that the automatic thought is, or the negative thought. You would maybe phrase it in the third person, as if you're observing someone else thinking it, and you would describe it more slowly. So you're kind of slowing down your thinking, and you're viewing it as if it was an event over there, like an object. So you say, oh, I notice that Donald is having this thought, or I notice that Donald is saying to himself, oh shit, this is awful, or something like that. So it's now you're kind of looking at the thinking rather than immersing yourself in the thinking. So it's kind of a subtle shift of perspective. It's a little bit tricky to describe, but actually it's very simple. It's a very powerful technique.
It works better in the third person than in like...
Often, yeah, you don't have to do it that way, but you know, many people find that helps them to shift the perspective. Yeah.
And just deconstructing the technique. I think I have the problem with realizing that I'm getting anger. Mm-hmm. When it passes, I realize, okay, I got angry. But when it's happening right now, maybe is there any way to train that muscle to realize that I'm getting angry? That specific moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in doing that. I think that this is one of the most important things, right? And more important than the techniques, actually. You know, many people will overcome anger or other problems just by noticing it earlier. And we have a blind spot. We don't notice. So the first thing I would say to you is, you say it's difficult to notice when you're beginning to get angry, right? Mm-hmm. But maybe other people would see it differently. You know, perhaps other people would think, no, it's obvious when you're becoming angry. Because when you look at other people, you might look at them and think, this guy's obviously starting to get annoyed, right? Like sometimes it's obvious. How would you know? Well, like facial expression has changed a bit. Like he's kind of frowning, like he's kind of staring a bit more. And even on the telephone, if you couldn't see me and I was talking to you right now, like maybe you start to kind of tell if I was speaking differently and I was starting to sound annoyed. Like, and so you might go, well, I didn't really notice I was getting annoyed. And someone else might say, well, it's kind of obvious. I could hear it in your voice, buddy. Right. So first thing is just to encourage yourself to think maybe actually there are obvious signs that another person would be able to see. And then to start to look out a little bit more for those signs. So I think the trick is to actually say to yourself, maybe this is more obvious than I realize. You know, are my eye movements different? Are my facial expression different? Is the sound of my voice different? Am I saying different sorts of things to myself? And, you know, look out for and study it from that perspective. I think that potentially helps a lot. Okay. Also, typically people, we know from research in this area that often people, the first thing they'll notice is physical tension. Mm-hmm. So many people will say, I notice I start to tense my neck and shoulders when I'm just beginning to get angry. So it might be, you know, look out more carefully for very subtle signs of the beginning of physical tension.
I will do that. Thank you. And now just to finish this section of the interview, a last question about Stoic practices in times of pandemic, where we are probably facing a second confinement and we are going to stay at home a lot of time. Yeah. How can we face that when everything seems to be out of our control, at least for a year now.
Well, I'll tell you an odd thing about the pandemic. When the pandemic happened, everybody started to ask me, how do Stoics cope with a pandemic? Because we weren't expecting a pandemic, so how would the Stoic cope with it? And I'll say, well, first of all, the odd thing, and this might not seem that helpful, is that Stoics would already have prepared for it years ago. So one of the main things the Stoics do is to prepare in advance for typical catastrophe. Well, you know, Bill Gates actually would be a good example of somebody who was telling us years and years ago that there was probably going to be a pandemic. So it really isn't a surprise, right? These things happen throughout history. And so a good Stoic would have been already sitting there thinking, maybe one day there'll be a pandemic. How am I going to cope with that? You know, like it's outside of my control, so I should accept it and try and make the best of the situation. And so you might say, well, that's not very helpful, Donald, because it's too late to do that now. We're already in the middle of it. And I would say, yes, but actually, probably there'll be other things that happen in the future. Even when this pandemic is over, if you live long enough, you might end up seeing another one happen one day. And, you know, there'll be other like health problems, economic problems that happen in the future, typical things that happen throughout history. And, you know, a Stoic would say, this is a good opportunity to prepare for other adversities, other setbacks that might be coming in the future, to prepare maybe for like worse pandemics that might happen in the future. For all we know, it's possible. And other things we can do to cope with this pandemic are, the Stoics would say, first of all, like to practice gratitude. So Marcus Aurelius puts this really nicely. I think it's one of the nicest passages. It's very interesting. He says that most people will typically imagine absent things as if they were present. So people imagine things they don't have as if they did have them. And they fantasize about having them. They think, oh, I wish I had a Ferrari. Or I wish I had a big swimming pool, or I wish I had, you know, the latest iPhone or something. So they imagine absent things as if they were present. And Marcus says that just causes suffering, because it makes us aware of the difference between fantasy and reality, and we crave things. But we all tend to do that. And he said, however, we should make an effort to do it the other way around. And that's something that people don't normally do, which would be to imagine the absence of things that are actually present. And so I might think, oh, geez, imagine what it would be like if I didn't have running water, or imagine if I didn't have the internet, or imagine if I didn't have heating, or imagine if I didn't have a roof. I had to live in a little wooden shack in the winter. Imagine if I didn't have electricity or refrigeration. And then we would be experiencing gratitude for things that we all take for granted. There's so much to be grateful for. I mean, I'm lucky enough that I'm old enough. When I was a kid, we didn't have a refrigerator in our house when I was a boy. And so actually, when I practice this technique, I think I do take the fridge for granted. But I suddenly remember, geez, my mum didn't have a fridge when I was born. So, and we didn't have central heating. We had a little coal fire. We had to light it every morning in the winter in the snow. And so the Stoics would say, even during a pandemic, there are many things to be grateful for and to appreciate. And also the Stoics would say, if you're concerned about the risk, we should also meditate on our own mortality anyway, and accept the fact that, you know, we don't know whether we're going to wake up tomorrow or not, and therefore we should learn to be grateful for each moment that we have, and to be grounded in the present and to appreciate it more fully. Stoics would be ready for that, and they would continue to prepare themselves for it. And also by making the most of the situation that we're in. So Stoics would say, one of the questions that Marcus asks himself is, what virtue has nature given me in order to deal with this situation? Like, so that's like asking yourself, you know, how could I cope well even with lockdown? Like, some people cope badly with lockdown, other people cope better with lockdown. So the Stoics would say, think about it that way, as a simple dichotomy. Ask yourself, what does it look like when someone copes really badly with lockdown psychologically? And what would it look like for someone to cope well? What's the difference between coping well and coping badly? And how could I be more like the person who copes well? This is a very simple strategy. You could apply that to anything. I find it useful for people who suffer from chronic pain. So people who suffer from chronic pain or illness often find it hard to imagine another way of coping. But they could ask themselves very simply, of course, someone else might have the same condition that I have and cope really badly with it, and another person might cope remarkably well with it. And what would be the difference between those two ways of thinking, those two ways of coping? And how could I try and nudge myself more towards the better, the more admirable way of coping with adversity?
Yeah, actually, we can do that exercise for everything. Like, what would do Marcus Aurelius, or what would Socrates do, or Seneca?
Epictetus says everything has two handles. There's a good handle and a bad handle. Like, there's a good way of coping with it, and he said you make sure you pick it up by the good handle, not the broken handle. Like, but we need to make an effort to do that, because if we don't pay attention, like, we often will automatically fall into the habit of trying to pick things up with the broken handle, or coping badly with things.
It's difficult, but we have to be aware and present to do that. Just talking about deeper about Stoicism. If we want to start practicing Stoicism, do we have to go all in? Do we have to buy 100%? Or, for instance, what happens if I have higher values than the 4 Stoic virtues, such as love or creativity or loyalty? Is there any conflict between them, or?
Well, I think actually people disagree about this. Like, Cicero would be an example of an eclectic dilettante, like a dabbler in Stoicism. So Cicero takes lots of bits of Stoicism, but he doesn't call himself a Stoic. Epictetus says the opposite. Epictetus says it's all or nothing to his students. He's quite strict. He said, if you're dabbling in this, then it won't really work out. You need to go all in if you want to be a Stoic. He says at the beginning of the handbook. He says that near the start of the Enchiridion. And I can kind of see it both ways. I think if you don't agree with the values of Stoicism, you could use the techniques and you'd benefit from them, but you're potentially doing something kind of different. It's like Socrates said that the sophists sound exactly like philosophers a lot of the time. They talk about virtue a lot. But Socrates said, but the reason they are doing it is to try and impress people. So their fundamental reason for doing it is different. Whereas Socrates says his reason for doing it is because he wants to actually become wise and virtuous. Like, he wants to transform himself, not just like impress other people. He says, so we both have the same conversations. We both talk about the same things, but we're doing it for fundamentally different reasons. We're heading in opposite directions when we use these techniques. So maybe it does make a difference in that sense. If you don't have the same values, creativity and so on. Yeah, I mean, the Stoics would say that if we reflect on our values deeply enough, they're confident that we're going to arrive at similar conclusions. Creativity is an interesting one. So I would actually say that really the main value for the Stoics is wisdom. The main virtue is wisdom. And the other ones actually, in particular, courage and self-discipline, are more ambiguous, because Socrates had already pointed out that someone could have what appears to be courage or self-discipline and be vicious. So a robber could appear to act courageously someone, a genocidal maniac, an evil dictator, could seem to have self-discipline. And Socrates would say, well, we wouldn't call those virtues in that case. They only become virtues if courage and self-discipline are used in the service of wisdom and justice. And maybe we should call it something else. So maybe someone who runs into a burning house to save a child, you might say is courageous. Someone who runs into a burning house to save their assigned autograph of David Hasselhoff, you would say that's not courageous. That's just like stupid or like recklessness or whatever. The priorities are wrong, right? So Socrates would say that this kind of boldness only really becomes a virtue, like courage, if it's in the service of wisdom and justice. Now, I think the same is true of creativity. So I could be a creative torturer. Like, I could come up with loads of creative ways to torture small children or something like that, or old ladies. And you would say, well, that's not a virtue. Like, that's a terrible thing. So the Stoics would say, if we question this more deeply, then maybe creativity in itself isn't a virtue, but it becomes virtuous if it's done in the service of wisdom and justice and the good. So if I was very creative at thinking of ways to feed a starving village, you would think, oh, that's virtuous creativity. But there could also, if I was very creative at designing bombs, or something like that, you might say, well, that's not virtuous creativity. So I think the Stoics would say there are many things that potentially contribute to virtue, but we need to reflect deeply on what it is that makes them good. And they would say it's that they're being used in the service of wisdom and justice.
Curious. I never thought about it like that, but it's true. Yeah, it's curious. And just to finish the interview, 2 more questions. One, if we have talked about the sophists and the people who speak not to seek the truth, but to have the reason or to impress people. Do you think there are actually currently, sophists in this world? I mean, when I see Stoicism in social network, I see people working out, having cold showers, and going to Silicon Valley at 4 in the morning. Is that the Stoicism, or
are they sophists? Well, I used to think about it, right? First of all, I think it's better to say Marcus Aurelius says that whenever you're angry or annoyed with someone else, you should pause and ask yourself whether you're not doing the same thing also. And I think we should say, it'd be better to say, is it possible that we're all sophists in a sense? Otherwise, we risk blaming other people for things and having a blind spot to our own flaws. I think it's safer to say, maybe to varying degrees, we're all guilty of similar vices. Marcus Aurelius would say that. He would say, when you're annoyed with someone else, you first of all ask yourself if you're not capable of having this vice yourself. So 100%, I think we're all sophists in a way. And even Socrates was had some sophist blood in his veins. He sometimes acts like a bit of a sophist. He's not completely free from that. And I think so. But also I would say that the real modern equivalent of the sophist, I think, isn't a person. I think it's social media in general. Facebook is a sophist. Twitter is a sophist. They're digital sophists. The sophists would tell you whatever would get the biggest round of applause. So they don't care whether it's true or false or healthy or unhealthy. They would literally have competitions, and the person who got the most applause would be the winner. So if they said something that Socrates said and it got a big round of applause, then they would say it. But the next day, if they said the opposite and it got a better applause, then they would go with that. So that's exactly what Facebook does. It will tell you whatever gets the most engagement or the most likes. It's the same thing. It's driven by engagement. And the news media will tell you whatever you respond to. So the news will maybe tell you things that are exaggerated or distorted because it gets your attention, in the same way that sophists are attention junkies. Like they want to grab your attention, and they want you to come and attend their lectures, the same way the media do this to us today. Just the modern equivalent. That's throughout the ages, there are always people that want to be the center of attention, and you know, the media really serve that role now, and they'll tell us whatever they think is going to frighten us or make us angry or get our attention because they make money from that. I think, you know, and we're all guilty of that to some extent. And, you know, the main thing is just to really take responsibility for it. First of all, a Stoic would say every morning when you get up, tell yourself, today I'm going to meet sophists and people who are trying to manipulate my attention and so on. So a Stoic would expect other people to lie and deceive and manipulate. A Stoic would expect to be surrounded by sophists and be prepared for it. And actually, you know, ironically, the Stoics would say there's, in a sense, in an odd sense, it's a good thing. Because if you lived in Zeno's ideal republic and you were just surrounded by perfect sages, you would never really have an opportunity to exercise some of the virtues. You need to encounter adversity in order to exhibit courage and self-discipline. And that includes encountering difficult people. This is why Marcus Aurelius said, like the upper and lower jaws or the two hands, they're designed to work together. We need adversaries. We need liars, criminals, corrupt politicians. Otherwise, life would be too easy. We wouldn't want that. It would be very boring. So there's a sense in which, although these are things we want to remove from society and overcome, you know, it gives us an opportunity to become virtuous ourselves and to strengthen our own character. Marcus said we should think of them like sparring partners. Like they give us an opportunity to strengthen our virtues. So it's terrible that social media is bombarding us with misinformation and fake news and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But it also gives us an opportunity to strengthen our own character and exercise wisdom and be more discerning. So we should look at it, the Stoics think we should look at it as an opportunity for self-improvement.
I love that idea. And I learned that in one of your courses about Socrates, you said that her wife threw him cold water and he saw that as an opportunity to be a better philosopher. So
yeah, well, like you say, people in Silicon Valley have cold showers every day now. So like, you know, if today Socrates would say this is a good thing, it's like the Wim Hof method or something. She's, and, you know, encouraging him to have a cold shower. He said his wife's name is Xanthopy, which in Greek means yellow horse. And he said it's like someone who trains horses doesn't just pick the easy horses to work with, or they would never develop the skill as a horse trainer. And he said he loved his wife, but she was difficult, and gave him an opportunity to develop his character.
Okay, I think it's a good idea to finish the interview, to find everything as an opportunity to have a strong character. I always ask this question to all the invitees. Who would you like me to interview?
Who would be a good person to interview? Let me think. So I think a good person to interview would be to talk about Stoicism is Massimo Pilucci. He also writes a lot of books about Stoicism. He's part of our Modern Stoicism organization, the team.
I interviewed him already.
You've done him already?
Yeah.
In that case, I think perhaps my friend Jules Evans, who wrote Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations.
Okay.
He writes books about Stoicism and other ancient philosophies. So he might be an interesting person for you to interview.
I will. Thank you. Where can people find you if they want to know more about Donald Robertson?
They can find me at my website is donaldrobertson.name. So instead of .com, it's .name.name. And that has all my social media links and everything, and e-learning courses and books, like on my website.
Perfect. I will link that to the episode notes.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for the interview. It's been
Well,
awesome talking to you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.